There's a particular kind of love that looks generous on the surface, but quietly erodes the self underneath. It's the kind of love that gives everything: comfort, praise, protection, opportunity, but asks for something invisible in return: obedience, admiration, dependence. Many people grow up not in families that neglected them, but in families that never let them fall. At first, it feels like devotion. Parents who call you their whole world, who solve every problem before you even notice it exists, who proudly say, "You don't have to worry about anything, I'll take care of it." But over time, that same love becomes something heavier. A golden cage built from good intentions. Today, I want to talk about that kind of parenting, the narcissistic pattern of overprotection and indulgence, and how it quietly shapes a child's inner world. Because while we often imagine narcissistic parents as controlling or cruel, many of them are instead overly generous, overly involved, and emotionally possessive in ways that feel like love. But make no mistake, both patterns are driven by the same root need. The parent's identity depends on the child. Psychologists call this enmeshment, when boundaries blur and the parent's emotional state becomes fused with the child's. In such families, the child isn't raised to be independent. They are raised to be an extension. Their success is a reflection of the parent's worth, their happiness is the parent's proof of love, and their dependence is a quiet form of control. Let's slow this down. In healthy parenting, love is a mirror. It reflects the child back to themselves so they can slowly discover who they are. But in narcissistic parenting, love becomes a spotlight. It blinds the child with attention that's always angled from one direction. So the child learns not to ask, "Who am I?" but rather, "Who am I supposed to be for them?" When the parent constantly praises, protects, and provides, the child's life feels safe but strangely hollow. Because beneath the surface, there's no room left for uncertainty, frustration, or failure, the natural teachers of maturity. The child is unconsciously taught that love and approval come from staying small enough for the parent to always be the rescuer. And so, ironically, the spoiled child doesn't become confident, they become fragile. They learn dependency disguised as entitlement. They expect the world to respond like the parent once did, with endless validation, endless correction, endless rescue. And when reality doesn't oblige, they experience what psychologists call narcissistic injury, a deep and disproportionate sense of humiliation and rage when the world refuses to treat them as special. It's tempting to look at this outcome and blame the parent outright. But we must remember, narcissistic parenting rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with fear. Fear of being unneeded, fear of losing control, fear of their child's independence, because independence means separation, and separation feels like rejection. Many narcissistic parents were themselves raised in emotional starvation. They grew up having to perform for love, so they overcorrect in the next generation. They say, "My child will never feel what I felt." And in doing so, they swing to the other extreme, giving so much attention that the child never develops a sense of inner direction. The philosopher Erich Fromm once wrote, "Motherly love is supposed to be unconditional, but it is often the most conditional of all." In the narcissistic family, the condition isn't explicit obedience or perfection, it's emotional fusion. The unspoken rule is, "You can have everything as long as you stay mine." The tragedy is that this pattern often produces children who seem incredibly confident on the surface. They're expressive, articulate, high-achieving. But underneath, their sense of self is borrowed. Every decision unconsciously asks, would they approve? Every risk feels dangerous because it threatens the only identity they've ever known. We call this externalized self-worth, a psychological dependence on outer approval rather than inner conviction. And it's the reason so many people raised in these systems oscillate between pride and emptiness. The spoiled child doesn't know how to regulate frustration because it was always removed. They don't know how to tolerate uncertainty because answers were always provided. They don't know how to accept failure because someone always cushioned the fall. So they grow into adults who confuse discomfort with danger and effort with injustice. But beneath this fragility lies a profound truth. The overindulged child isn't weak. They were never allowed to develop strength. They were protected from pain at the cost of resilience. And as Alan Watts might have said, a life built only to avoid the dark never learns what light truly is. When we look closely, we begin to see that the spoiled child and the narcissistic parent are not opposites at all. They are reflections, two halves of the same misunderstanding about love. The parent believes love means possession. The child learns love means dependence. And this misunderstanding forms a kind of invisible contract between them. The parent says, "I'll give you everything so long as you need me." The child replies, "I'll need you so long as you keep giving." Neither sees that both are trapped. The parent remains powerful only by keeping the child small. The child remains loved only by staying helpless. This is the quiet tragedy of overprotection, a circular dependency masquerading as devotion. In philosophy, this dynamic echoes the ancient paradox of the master and the servant. Hegel described it as the dialectic of recognition, that strange human hunger to feel real only through another's eyes. The master controls, believing this dominance makes him whole. The servant obeys, believing this obedience ensures safety. But both depend on the other to exist. This is the hidden logic behind narcissistic love. Both parties confuse control with connection. And so when the spoiled child grows up, they unconsciously recreate the same pattern, not because they're cruel, but because it's all they've ever known. They enter relationships expecting caretakers, rescuers, or admirers. When partners, teachers, or employers fail to orbit around them, they feel unseen, unloved, or betrayed. Psychologists call this narcissistic wounding, the panic that emerges when external validation withdraws. But it is, at its core, the wound of someone who never learned to self-generate worth. And here lies a painful irony. The parent's desire to make their child special actually deprives them of individuality. Because to be truly oneself, one must face limitation, frustration, and failure, experiences that teach us where we end and the world begins. Without those edges, the ego inflates without substance. It becomes vast but hollow, large enough to contain praise, too fragile to contain disappointment. In that sense, narcissistic indulgence is not the opposite of neglect. It is another form of neglect, neglect of reality. The child is deprived not of affection, but of contact with truth. And in adulthood, that deprivation manifests as a constant hunger for admiration, for reassurance, for something that feels like proof of existence. Alan Watts once said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth." This is precisely what happens to those raised under narcissistic indulgence. They spend years constructing identities from reflected images, only to realize they were never allowed to see themselves directly. Many of these adults eventually reach a point of exhaustion. They have achievements, perhaps comfort, perhaps status, yet beneath it all, there's an unshakable sense of emptiness. And that emptiness is not a lack of success, but a lack of separation. They've been living as a reflection so long that the very idea of having their own mind feels foreign, even frightening. This is why independence can feel like betrayal to those raised by narcissistic parents. It's not that they don't want autonomy, it's that autonomy feels like abandonment. The mind quietly whispers, If I stop needing them, will they still love me? And even in adulthood, that whisper persists, echoing through careers, marriages, friendships. The paradox deepens here. The very freedom that would complete them feels like the one thing they must never take. And so, they oscillate between defiance and guilt, between rebellion and dependence, seeking a balance that cannot exist until the illusion itself is seen through. If we step back for a moment, we might recognize something profound. Narcissistic family systems aren't simply about bad parenting, they are a mirror of an entire culture that worships comfort, control, and image. We reward those who appear self-assured, flawless, unbothered, while quietly discouraging vulnerability and uncertainty. In that way, society itself behaves like a narcissistic parent, overprotecting us from discomfort, feeding us validation, and leaving us hollow at the core. To understand narcissistic parenting, then, is not to isolate a few dysfunctional families. It is to understand the water we all swim in. We are, in many ways, collectively spoiled by our avoidance of limits. And like the overindulged child, we become fragile under the weight of our own convenience. Philosophically, the only way out of this pattern is through what the Taoists called Wu Wei, effortless action, or the art of allowing things to unfold naturally. It means accepting that love must contain risk, that genuine care sometimes allows pain, that strength is not born from protection, but from exposure. So when a parent says, "I don't want my child to ever suffer," we must gently ask, do you mean you don't want them to be harmed, or do you mean you don't want them to grow beyond your reach? Because to love without control is to accept the sacred heartbreak of independence, to let the child become a mystery to you, as all souls eventually must. And perhaps that is the lesson buried beneath all narcissistic systems, that love cannot be proven through possession and identity cannot survive as a mirror. When both parent and child see this clearly, the cycle begins to dissolve, not through confrontation, but through understanding. Healing from this dynamic doesn't begin with blame. It begins with recognition. You can't reclaim what you don't yet realize was taken. When you grow up in a narcissistic family, whether you were over-controlled or overprotected, your nervous system learns that peace depends on someone else's approval. So the first act of healing is to pause before reacting, to notice that impulse to please, to fix, to prove, to be seen. That pause is not resistance, it's recovery. Because in that tiny space between stimulus and response, you begin to sense the faint outline of your own self. The mind will tell you you're being selfish, but what you're really doing is learning selfhood, perhaps for the first time. This is why healing from narcissistic parenting feels so strange. It doesn't always feel like peace. At first, it feels like guilt. Guilt for setting boundaries, guilt for saying no, guilt for disappointing the person who once defined your worth. But guilt is not proof that you're wrong. It's proof that you're leaving the script. As you start to separate, something remarkable happens. You begin to see the parent not as a god nor as a villain, but as a person, limited, frightened, and shaped by the same hunger for validation that once shaped you. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it transforms your relationship to it. Compassion, in this sense, is not forgiveness in the moral sense. It's perception without distortion. You start to see the system, not just the story. You realize this wasn't personal, it was generational. From there, the work becomes gentler. You begin to shift from reacting to observing. Instead of asking, how do I stop being like them? You start asking, what am I still trying to protect? Often, it's the inner child who still believes that love must be earned, that autonomy means abandonment, that pleasing is safety. So the task is not to destroy those patterns, but to reassure them. To become the kind of parent your younger self never had, one who doesn't over-control or over-indulge, but simply witnesses. That witnessing is powerful, because awareness itself begins to dissolve the illusion. When you can see the dynamic clearly, the impulse to rescue, the fear of failure, the subtle pride in being needed, you can choose differently. You might still help others, but without performing saviorhood. You might still love deeply, but without merging. You might still give, but not to prove your worth. This is what maturity actually is, the ability to give without losing yourself. Let's take a moment to look at what this means for parents themselves. Because many listeners are not only the children of narcissistic families, they are now parents, trying to do better. If you recognize these patterns in yourself, the solution isn't to withdraw your love, it's to depersonalize it. To understand that your child's life is not a reflection of your success, but an independent unfolding of consciousness. When your child fails, resist the urge to fix or redefine the moment. Sit beside them in the discomfort and let the experience speak for itself. When they succeed, celebrate, but don't take credit. Let their pride belong to them. When they disagree, resist the instinct to interpret it as disrespect. It may simply be a sign that they trust you enough to have their own thoughts. The healthiest love creates distance without disconnection. It says, "You belong to life, not to me." This shift from ownership to stewardship changes everything, because it turns parenting from a form of ego extension into an act of reverence. Reverence for the unpredictable, the uncontrollable, the beautifully separate being standing before you. And if you're the grown child of such a system, your task is similar, to turn awareness into practice. This means learning to tolerate the small discomforts that your parent once removed: boredom, frustration, uncertainty, even rejection. Each time you do, you build inner strength, the very thing you were once denied. You might feel awkward or lost, as if you're learning to walk after years of being carried. That's normal. Growth often feels like grief because you're mourning the years you didn't get to build this self earlier. But the beautiful truth is that it's never too late to mature. Emotional growth isn't bound by age. It begins whenever awareness does. In Taoism, there's a saying, "The softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest." That softness, patience, humility, curiosity, is your new teacher. It's how you move from reacting to relating, from controlling to connecting. Over time, you'll notice something subtle shifting. Moments of silence no longer feel empty. Disapproval no longer feels fatal. Success no longer feels like proof. These are signs that your sense of self is returning home, no longer orbiting around the gaze of another, but resting quietly at the center of your own being. And the beauty of this work is that it naturally radiates outward. When you stop performing for love, you unconsciously give others permission to do the same. When you stop rescuing, others begin discovering their own resilience. When you stop demanding admiration, relationships start breathing again. What was once control becomes care. What was once dependence becomes connection. What was once enmeshment becomes intimacy. This is how cycles end, not through confrontation, but through awareness. There's a moment in every healing journey when you stop asking, "How do I fix them?" and begin asking, "What can I learn from them?" It's a subtle shift, but a profound one. Because when you move from control to curiosity, you exit the very system that hurt you. The truth is, every narcissistic family begins with love. It's just that somewhere along the way, love was mistaken for possession. And possession always begins with fear. The fear that if I don't hold tightly enough, I will lose you. But love, in its purest form, doesn't require holding. It only requires seeing. A healthy parent sees the child as a separate universe, one that can never fully be owned or controlled. That distance isn't a threat, it's sacred space. Yet the narcissistic parent cannot tolerate that distance. Their fear of insignificance drives them to close the gap, to fuse identities, to make the child a mirror instead of a mystery. And so, what began as devotion quietly transforms into domination, though it rarely looks like it. It often looks like care. It often sounds like love. But care that does not allow growth is not love, it's containment. And love that cannot tolerate separation is not intimacy, it's fusion. The philosopher Martin Buber once wrote that real relationship exists only between I and thou, never between I and it. In other words, to love someone is to meet them as a being, not a possession. And that includes our children. When a parent sees their child as an extension of themselves, they cannot truly relate, they can only manage. And management, no matter how gentle, replaces love with control. But when we begin to see this clearly, something beautiful happens. The illusion starts to crack, and within that fracture, compassion enters. You start to see that the narcissistic parent was also once a child, perhaps over-controlled, perhaps overpraised, perhaps made to carry the emotional burden of their own parents' fears. Their identity, too, was constructed from mirrors and expectations. They gave you what they knew, and what they knew was performance. Realizing this doesn't excuse the pain, but it softens the edge. It opens the possibility of ending the cycle, not through punishment, but through perception. And that is where healing becomes philosophy, when understanding replaces resentment. Because when you truly see the system, you stop playing your part in it. You stop chasing approval because you finally understand. No amount of applause can replace self-recognition. You stop fearing failure because you understand that growth only happens through friction. You stop overprotecting others because you know that pain, too, has its purpose. This is the paradox of healing from narcissistic love. You learn to care more deeply precisely by letting go of control. It's what the mystics have always meant when they say, to die before you die. You allow the false image of who you thought you had to be, the perfect child, the constant giver, the flawless parent, to dissolve. And what remains is not emptiness but aliveness. In that quiet space, something ancient awakens. A sense of being that doesn't depend on anyone's gaze. A love that isn't about reflection, but recognition. You realize that love was never meant to be symmetrical. It isn't a ledger of exchange, nor a hierarchy of need. It's an atmosphere in which two beings evolve, sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always in truth. And when you see that clearly, the old anxiety softens. You stop asking, am I loved enough? And begin wondering, am I truly seeing the one before me? This is the final freedom, to love without owning, to give without fearing loss, to stand beside others without losing your center. The narcissistic family system is, at its heart, a confusion between identity and connection. It tries to merge the two, but in truth, the deepest connection can only arise between two distinct selves. It's the space between us that allows love to breathe. So if you were spoiled, smothered, or controlled in the name of care, understand that you were not loved too much, you were loved too conditionally. And your work now is not to reject love, but to redefine it. Love, in its most authentic form, doesn't seek to complete you. It simply witnesses you as you are. It celebrates your difference, not your dependence. And so, healing from narcissistic parenting is ultimately not about detaching from your family. It's about remembering that you were never meant to be anyone's reflection. You were meant to be a window, open to the world, shaped by experience, illuminated by your own light. Let that be your quiet act of rebellion, to live not as someone's masterpiece, but as your own becoming. Because in the end, freedom doesn't mean cutting ties, it means dissolving illusion. The illusion that love and control are the same, the illusion that worth is earned through admiration, the illusion that protection must replace pain. When those illusions fall away, what remains is something beautifully ordinary, a life that doesn't need to be perfect to be enough. So take a breath. Let the roles fall away. Let the story rest. And perhaps in that stillness, you'll find what was missing all along. Not the parent's voice, not the world's approval, but the quiet pulse of your own being, reminding you you were always whole.